So they made their statement in English that they already had posted in the Discord the other day, right? So we don't necessarily have to go and rehash that. But basically what they did is they promised that they would be releasing documentation to support the claims that they had been making all along in the Discord. We don't necessarily have to rehash like the entire argument, but basically Iron Mace's side of this is that it's such a generic idea, and the characters in the game and the way that the game is being produced and created is such a generic idea that it can't possibly be like proprietary. So this morning at about 1:30 in the morning, Terry said that he was releasing, or prior to this, Terry said that they were going to be releasing evidence. And this morning he said, we will be releasing our evidence as we get them approved by our legal counsel. Here's the first batch. And then our Korean response to the takedown claim, which is the letter that was already written out in English above in the Discord, so we don't need to go through and rehash that. The concept artist's actual response, which was written in Korean from the concept artists themselves. This is Dark and Darker's concept artist. Through this document, we would like to refute the allegation that the concept of P3 was stolen from Dark and Darker. So Nexon claims that Dark and Darker was developed using P3's assets and claims to be suspicious because of their visual similarity. The contents below are intended to refute this and explain what parts we focused on in class design and why the claim that the results are similar are not valid. Dark and Darker's classes are made up of classes commonly handled in Dungeons and Dragons and medieval fantasy games influenced by it and aim for familiar classic fantasy concepts. It cannot be seen that it has the distinctive features of Dark and Darker in appearance or design. Dark and Darker worked on the class concept based on these following three concerns. What are the most familiar classes in the memories of classic fantasy fans, which is something that we discussed the last time? What design can you accept without hesitation even if you're not a fan of classic fantasy? What is the range that can be expressed with the assets you own, purchased assets, right? P3 and Darker have the same concept artist, i.e. because I worked on both. He's the same concept artist. The way the characters are portrayed or the painting style may feel similar, but there are significant differences in detailed composition such as costumes. The following will refute the claim that the classes of P3 and Darker are similar by comparing each class. When I started thinking about Dark and Darker's Barbarian, I initially tried to work with a barbaric warrior feel like Conan the Barbarian. However, I had to use the purchased armor assets in common, so I had no choice but to switch to the current Nordic Viking feel. And this is something that I had suggested in the video that I made, and when we discussed this the last time, is you had an armor pack that you bought for the game that you were going to create, right? Like we're going to make a medieval fantasy dungeon crawler. What assets can we go and buy, right? Like armor or whatever. What assets can we go and buy to dress up the characters that we're going to end up bringing in? So what he's basically saying is that he wanted to make a barbarian like Conan, but they didn't have the assets to work with to be able to make it reflective, like to make the concept art reflective based on the asset packs that they had purchased from the Unreal Asset Store. So he couldn't do that. So he made a barbarian that was going to roughly look like the assets that they could get their hands on. Even if I drew concept art, I did not have enough time to create assets for it. So I changed the direction of the concept art according to the assets. See? So a draft of Dark and Darker's Barbarian that was scrapped in the works. So this is like the original design that he wanted, right? Like Conan style, but they couldn't do this with the assets that they had. And then figure 2, Barbarian used for loading image after drafting. So like this was an idea that he had for like Barbarian styles, but they couldn't get this. So then they had to switch, right? Figure 3 below is various concept art of the Barbarian that I referenced during work in this regard. Based on this, we focused on creating a Barbarian that fits the worldview of Dark and Darker and designing it so there's no particular problem when using equipment of other classes in common. So again, like now you can see that this is a lot more closely resembled, like in the Nordic style, of the armor that was available in the asset packs that they had produced from the Unreal Store, right? So he's pulling concept art from Assassin's Creed Valhalla to work from. And you can even see like the logos of AC Valhalla are on here. So this is where he was pulling inspiration from. So then they said Nexon's claiming that P3's Barbarian and Dark and Darker's Barbarian are similar. As explained earlier, Dark and Darker's Barbarian was created based on works from common fantasy worlds and furthermore those used in various games. So this is Nexon's claim right here. These are the P3 game versus Dark and Darker's Barbarian and the stylistic similarities, right? Even in the details, of course, there are differences. P3's Barbarian is more colorful than Dark and Darker's Barbarian, such as having horns on their helmet, Nordic patterns of armor, their beard shape and cape, and the style is mixed. The shape of the helmet may look similar by adopting the design of the actual German helmet, Yelmo, but the detailed design is completely different. So I mean, and he has a point, right? Like, yes, they look similar, but they're not the same, right? This guy's he's got a piece of shoulder armor on. There's no shoulder armor on this guy, right? He's wearing chainmail. This dude's wearing plate. You know, like there's a whole bunch of differences. Class comparison 2, fighter. Dark and Darker's fighter class is a class specialized in melee attacks, wearing typical medieval knight armor. The items in Figure 5 below are reference materials when designing fighters and are also popularly used heavy armored warriors specializing with melee attacks. Through the items in Figure 6, you can see what process the current fighter design came out through. So again, he shows the concept art that he was inspired by, one of which is from Dark Souls, right? But there's, I mean, like these are all common like video game knights, right? Yeah, several of these are Dark Souls, right? Like this is a Dark Souls concept art piece. I think this one is too. And then there's additional concept art pieces. Like there's a lot of there's a lot of Soulsborne in these. Obviously, like I think that's a Dark Knight from Souls. Like that's a Dark Knight concept piece. A lot of this is Dark Souls concept art. Okay, and then Figure 6, fighter used for loading images after drafting, right? So we've seen this one plenty of times, right? P3's tanker and Darker's fighter, right? So remember that like one of their common things is to say that like they weren't, two of the classes weren't even like the exact same name. It was just the same class style. So there's basically what P3 alleged was, well, you're using a tanker, right? They changed the name from tanker to fighter, but it's like, well, you still used like a fighter class. Nexon claims that P3's tanker and Darker's fighter were produced in a similar form. However, as you can see from the picture in Figure 7, except for the open helmet, everything is different, including the appearance, armor design, weapon design, bag, and props. The figure wearing an open helmet is just a type of expression commonly used to show a character's face because it's obscured. So, and I mean, he's right, and we kind of picked this apart when we looked at this the last time when we were live, is, yeah, he has a one-handed sword, but this guy's holding a long sword. This looks like a short sword. He's got a two-handed axe on his back. This guy doesn't have a secondary weapon. Round shield versus kite shield. The leg armor is different. This guy doesn't even have a piece of plate on his left leg, whereas this guy does. You know, there's a completely stylistic difference between the chest plate that he has on and the shoulder plate that he has on compared to what this guy is wearing. Those are two completely different designs, other than the open helmet. And we said this before. So it's kind of like I felt like this one of all of them was like the most reaching, even though it was close. Okay, class comparison Ranger. In games and movies set in the Middle Ages, Rangers were often depicted wearing hoods, and purchase assets also included hoods. The costumes depicted in the Dark and Darker illustration were designed with reference to the asset costumes that we already owned. Right, and I had said this from the beginning. Like they bought a medieval armor pack with the character models, and that's what they had on. So naturally, they're going to make art that depicts whatever you're playing in game, at least at some level, right? Appearance by referencing to the clothing on the left and the hood on the right. So here's the Ranger used for the loading image, and then here's the concept art that they pulled from. Right, there's a lot of like just old school Ranger tropes. You know, a lot of Assassin's Creed in here. And then concept designs. These were concept designs from other artists. And then here's the P3 Games argumentative point. This was the concept art for P3, which, I mean, you can see where they pulled from a ton of stuff in here. Like, I mean, it's basically this dude is just wearing a red tunic instead of a gray one or a brown one. And then here's Dark and Darker's concept. Now, like this, again, to me, is like a huge, massive stretch. Even in the concept art for Dark and Darker that they reference in their claim, you can't even say that the two styles are the same. This looks like copy and pasted like flash art almost, and this looks like somebody made a watercolor painting in their bedroom, you know, or like a charcoal drawing. Like they're not even close to the same thing. It's only like they're only claiming this because the archer's holding a bow. Like in this one, like the Ranger has his quiver like mid back. This guy's got his quiver on his hip, right? Like he's got like a utility pouch or something on his left hip. This guy's it looks like he's holding like a white bag or something, and he's got traps hanging off. The only thing that I can see that's similar would be the trap that's hanging off of his belt in both of these images. But I mean, other than that, they are stylistically like completely different pieces of artwork. Dark and Darker's Ranger has borrowed the overall color from common designs to keep the sensibility of the old fantasy intact. Also, in order to express the concept of a hunter who fights while hiding in the dark, the use of colors was limited and designed with low saturation. Right, because hunters like dimly lit arrows so that the areas so that they can shoot arrows into your head, you know? As you can see by comparing P3 and Darker's Ranger illustrations, they are not the same except that they wear hoods and have bows. Okay, class comparison Wizard. How many wizards do we need to see throughout like lore between Tolkien and Disney, right? I mean, you have Radagast, you have Gandalf, you have Saruman, right? I mean, like there's a ton of ultra famous wizards that you can go and pull from just in Tolkien. And then there's all of the Dungeons and Dragons descriptions of what wizards are and what they do, plus like the adjacent classes like sorcerers, witches. Like, I mean, they all wear like the broad brimmed like pointy hat, or they have like the cowl over their face. They always have like a wizard staff or a book, right? I mean, like there's so many of these. And then of course, yeah, the long like wizard beard. I mean, for fuck's sake, there's a drinking game called Wizard Staff where you tape beer cans on the top of each other. Like, I mean, you can't get more like Dungeons and Dragons. How are you gonna make a fantasy game, right? Like a low fantasy game, a basic fantasy game where you want magic involved, but you're not going to include a wizard? Like that just, like, how could you get away with it? Like every fantasy game has a wizard. So concept designs by other artists. And then here's the other thing too, right? Like when I saw this the first time, I was like, okay, so you have young wizard versus older wizard. Cause this guy here, I think his hair is like reddish in the image. This guy reminded me more of like Ronin from like World of Warcraft lore than anybody, right? And then this guy, I was like, oh, this is just Gandalf. He's just young. Like that's how I saw it. So, like the image of the other classes described earlier, Dark and Darker's wizard expressed a more traditional and classic wizard than P3's wizard, wearing a long and cumbersome robe for an adventurer's appearance. It was produced with the intention of taking the form of an old man who's old but wise and still capable of fighting. There you go. And likewise, in the case of Logs, other than wearing a hood, the P3... So I think this is supposed to be Rogue. It's just messed up in translation. The P3 and Darker rogues have different components such as weapons and costumes. In the case of the Rogue, we tried to embody the real thief's play rather than simply wielding a fast weapon such as a dagger. It is actually possible to steal while playing, right? Because they have pickpocket even though no one really uses it. And for this purpose, the weapon was highlighted at the beginning, and finally it's made in the form of emphasizing the money bag held in their hand. Rather, in the case of a rogue, the design was made to approach the essence of a thief more than a thief generally seen. So what he's saying is in P3's Thief originally, the idea of a thief was a not only a stylistic difference, but also a design change. So the rogue is actually played differently in concept than how a thief would be played. But again, like completely different concept art. Cleric. All right, before I even need to look at this, right? That's the Templar armor from the asset pack that we already saw in the Unreal Marketplace like 3-4 days ago. And that's the concept art that was drawn, was using the Templar armor, the blue and white like checkered pattern. Like that is exactly what was drawn like in the concept art for Dark and Darker. Like you could tell it was inspired by the actual armor that was being worn because that's what you would see in the game. The class called Cleric is designed with Templar Knights as motif. Dark and Darker Clerics also adopted a design with a tunic wrapped around chainmail to match this popular design. Also, like other classes, it had to be created based on the assets you have, so I designed it with reference to the assets below. Polyphoria's assets referencing clothing design. So again, like Knights Templar, Clerics, you know, that you always see that shit. In D&D lore, they have a shield with a sigil on it, and that's usually where they get their casting ability from. And then you have like the guy with the big two-handed mace. Okay, so and then here's the P3 game. Again, like, here you go, boss. You know, like here's your art, you know, and then on this side, it's like, fuck yeah, like here's a cleric. I'm wasted and I'm gonna beat some shit. If you compare P3 and Dark and Darker's clerics, you can see that there are many differences in armor, costume, and patterns, right? So like that's the Templar armor that he's wearing in the game. And then you've got like the starting shield because they get like that little buckler, and then the one-handed mace. Conclusion: P3 and Darker are different. In this way, the design of the classes expressed in Dark and Darker is only the result of selecting the ones that are most suitable for Dark and Darker among one of the character designs that have appeared in various fantasy games that have been dealt with for decades, and are not designed by stealing P3's trade secrets. In conclusion, the allegation of theft is only a phenomenon that arises from the fact the concepts of the two projects are oriented toward a medieval fantasy worldview. We, the development team of Iron Mace, focused in the direction of the game we're aiming for and designed and expressed it accordingly. You can't help but agree. What I found interesting about their suit, though, is that they claimed that the pacing of the game and stuff was the same. And they're making that claim without having provided any type of like video gameplay evidence at all. The only piece of evidence that I've seen in any of their filings has been, and again, like none of this stuff is hitting Korean press, so it's not like we can go and like look and see what else they're submitting to court. But the only thing that I've seen is like the screenshot that they submitted to like a couple of game blogs when they were talking about like future releases. So, and then we have Git logs from Iron Mace going back to September 30th. And you can see how like they have Git logs of the assets that they are incorporating into their game, like in the order that they're incorporating them in. I don't understand like any of what this is other than seeing like file names being applied, right? And like they're talking about like the enhanced hearing perk. You know, they're building like each piece, right? Ranger perk, enhanced hearing, and then the assets that they're using. So yeah, the way that this looks like it's being portrayed is that the stuff that Nexon is saying was stolen is being used in the creation of the game, right? But if the concept artist that worked in both studios has the ability to differentiate between the two artistic offerings and show how they're different or what they were in reference to, it's kind of hard to say, well, that should be indicative of just our game and not somebody else's game, you know? Well, the company's saying that someone stole from them and then gave that to Iron Mace, so Iron Mace is being basically roped into this by saying Iron Mace is made from stuff that was stole from them because they're using the same files, right? The same files by name. They're using the same files, but all of those files are off the shelf. And the way that they're being assembled, the way that those files are being assembled, and the concept of the game, and the flow of the game, the way that the game is played, is the same to a project that they already own. That's what they're saying. So the question becomes, how similar is it? And is that something that you can enforce in court as a concept that was never actually marketed to the public? Because no one outside of the office ever played it. And as far as I'm aware, no one outside of the office has ever seen it played. So aside from them just saying it is like the same game, we've never actually seen that. So you can't copyright an idea in the US. When it comes to trade secret laws and stuff, Korea has an interesting law about trade secrets. So like here's the Unfair Trade Secrets Act. The definitions and terms used for this act. So the purpose of this act is to maintain orderly trade by preventing acts of unfair competition such as improper use of domestically well-known trademarks and trade names, and by preventing infringement of trade secrets. And then they go into talking about like acts of unfair competition. Trade secret means information including a production method, sale method, useful technical or business information for business activity that is not known publicly, is the subject of considerable effort to maintain its secrecy, and has independent economic value. So this is what they're being sued for. Acquiring of trade secrets by theft, using or disclosing them with the knowledge that an act of improper acquisition of the trade secrets has occurred. So this is what they have to figure out whether or not they are guilty of. The question is whether or not you can say something is a trade secret when it was bought at Walmart. But the unfortunate and most likely outcome is that Iron Mace ends up settling with the folks at Nexon, come to some agreement that will allow Iron Mace to continue to construct their game because of the money involved. Because like Nexon's not going to want to walk away from a bona fide payday, and Nexon will end up being paid some amount of royalty for it because they just don't, like, Iron Mace just doesn't have like fuck you money. You know what I mean? Like, and that's the definition of compromise. Nexon's not happy. Iron Mace isn't happy. Neither party's happy. That's compromise. Is Iron Mace still working on the game? I don't know. They haven't said. They probably can't say, because if they say like, yeah, we're still working on the game every day or whatever, that might actually get them in more legal hot water. You know, you don't want to give the perception that you're like ignoring anything. I'm trying to see if there's anything else. Oh yeah, and then they have a list of all the assets that they bought. Like these are all the marketplace purchases that they made. So and this is like the one other thing. You have to remember that all of this like you're copying our game stuff is coming from like their proof is like a single screenshot. Their proof is one screenshot. So in terms of like game loop and pacing and all this other stuff, like my question is, all right, well, you obviously have a roadmap in your possession at Nexon somewhere from whatever was in the logs at that studio. So my question is, for the roadmap that you had laid out for yourself, what was the game supposed to look like on the other end? Or do you have map layouts that were the same? Because it's one thing to say that like the concept of the game was the same, and we have these screenshots of like a dude walking around in a dimly lit hallway with torches on the wall, right? But you have that in Oblivion. From a concept standpoint, right? Like your roadmap, like the intentions of the game, was the intention to fight a final boss? How would they get there? How do you get to the final boss? Were there multiple levels? Did it have a BR mechanic? Was the map layout the same as what the map layouts are for Dark and Darker? at any of the iterations for Dark and Darker's construction. Like, was there a boss room with a wraith in it and a few archer skeletons? Like in the earliest days, did it have that like circular room with the pillars and like the mosquitoes flying around or whatever? And the skull bats? And did it have like chests in the middle? Like, what are we talking? Because if you can start showing me like map layouts where you have these modular building blocks that are being assembled, right, in like these grid patterns with hallways between them and everything, then maybe there's something there. If you're saying that in order to get between levels, like there was a timer and then there was going to be like a blue portal and a red portal, and like the red one took you down to like a harder difficulty level, and in the center of that level there was a big boss and like, you know, all that stuff, and like they start showing like, yeah, here's the concept for like the Lich boss, and he's got 6 skeletons around him in a circle that he summons when you walk in the room. Like, okay, then maybe you got something, right? Because now you're talking about like mechanics that are like so eerily similar. But if your evidence that you've got to work with is like a couple of screen caps depicting some market assets and like a torch throwing light on a wall and like a bug flying around in the background or whatever, that hasn't really shown me much. The only images that they've shown anyone in the press have been like Elder Scrolls Oblivion screen caps over the shoulder. So like people are saying like you couldn't have made that whole game in 10 months. They produced the entire single player side of the game, the entire Goblin Cave with the boss, the mechanics, all of the goblins, the caster goblins, the level design, everything from scratch in 6 weeks. Two of those weeks was them celebrating a holiday. So they generated that in a month. And Nexon hasn't said shit about any of it. Iron Mace couldn't have gotten the idea from the game without Iron Mace working at Nexon. Sure they could. I can show you where they could have gotten the idea. You want to see where they could have gotten the idea? Is that Dark and Darker? Could that be Dark and Darker? Hold on. Well, they definitely couldn't have come up with the idea for the tavern if it wasn't for working at Nexon, right? With the target dummies and stuff. There's no way they could have come up with that. Or the Goblin Cave. That had to have been done in Nexon, right? Or like the darkly lit dungeons with torches. See what I mean? But here's my point, right? Like, Chad, if you don't know, none of these pieces of art have anything to do with Dark and Darker or Project P3 at Nexon. Every single one of these images is an Elder Scrolls game. I mean, like one of their arguments was that people met at a tavern. This is 2004. Right, yeah, and then there's the meme with the Dark and Darker overlay. This is all Elder Scrolls Oblivion, right? Like, how could you say, like, Oblivion even has the damn red portal in it? If you had this as a matter of example, right? And all they did, like, and they put the UI over the top of it or whatever, right? But you have Elder Scrolls Oblivion with the UI from Dark and Darker overlaid on it. How could you argue? Like, and here's the other thing too, right? Like this is the UI for Oblivion even. It's not even like a weird thing to have like elements on the bottom, right? Like this is with like the weapons stuff and like all that. Like you could just say like the game was heavily inspired by Oblivion. All it is like just a little updated because it's UE5. Like Diablo's got the blue portal to take you home. There's a ton of games, actually. There's a bunch of games that have blue portals to take you home. Like every ARPG that's ever been created, I think, uses a blue portal to take you back to town. How many times do you start Dungeons and Dragons in a tavern? My point is like this like fantasy trope has been used in the idea of snuffing out torches on walls has been used since like 1997 in a video game, right? I'm not even talking about like Dungeons and Dragons stuff that has been done since the 70s and 80s where like, you know, just part of the gameplay was that you could turn on and off like torches on walls and stuff as just part of the game, right? Because mechanically you can do just about anything you want as long as it's within the rules, yeah? But mechanically, visually, in video games, it's been done since 1997. Thief was 97. Thief had a water arrow that you could shoot into a torch and snuff the light out.